Next on the line is Adam.
Yes.
Adam's presentation is on climate-induced biodiversity loss implications for sustainable development. Yes, you have the floor.
Thank you, Koma, for giving me this space and time. It's a pleasure to be here to have a chat with like-minded people about the basics of climate change and how it affects our biodiversity and eventually the life quality of Gambians and beyond. My talk will be on climate-induced biodiversity loss and its implication for sustainable development. I will try to refrain from making things too scientific because sometimes as scientists we tend to put people to sleep. That is why I will try to be as brief as possible in the scientific aspects. After all, this is a national discourse that we expect that every Gambian would be able to learn something from and be able to contribute towards. So first, we just talk about how climate change is globally known to affect biodiversity, either directly, that means at the level of the ecosystem, climate change could impact the quality, for example, of water or the condition of plants and various organisms found at ecosystem level. It can also affect our biodiversity indirectly, meaning it can instigate a process that could be negative to the quality standard of the known biodiversity. For instance, if in a marine environment, the salinity becomes too high due to lack of rainfall or drought, then it can instigate aggressive behavior of species found within the ecosystem. That is the indirect effects on biodiversity. And as we may all know, nature has distributed biodiversity in a deliberate pattern. And this pattern is relevant to the climatic zone that you find yourself in, which is why we always urge people to pay attention to the climatic zone they find themselves before making plans that can have global impacts on the quality of biodiversity we are in charge of. So for the African part, we have the main climatic zones such as the Sahel, the Sudan, the Guinean, and the Sahel of Sudan, where you find the Gambia. Sometimes you would have discussions and confusions can arise when we characterize a certain country in a climatic zone that it does not belong. That is dangerous for biodiversity. So Gambia is found in the Sahelo-Sudanian climate zone. The Sahel is known for having experienced the most drastic climatic conditions since the early 70s. The first known drought that occurred in the sub-Saharan area. But also Gambia is subjected to the impacts from the eastern side of Sudan, which manifest in the way of occasional floods. So we could say the rainfall is deficient, but if we look back in time, you'll find that every 4 or 5 years, there would be a flood that causes catastrophe to the livelihoods of Gambians. So these are important things to note when you are dealing with biodiversity. I would like to declare that I am a bit biased towards marine biodiversity because this is what I specialized in before coming into climate change. And as we know, biodiversity is very broad. You may want to anchor in one area in order not to cause confusion to your audience. So as we know, when we talk about climate change, people say greenhouse gas emission. And we all know the reports from UNFCCC, we know the reports from IPCC, IPBS, all of those things talking about the one thing. If the emissions continue right now, it is going to have drastic impact on biodiversity. If you look, for example, at one of our key economic zones, our key economic sectors is fisheries. And global fisheries is predicted to go through 40% decline in species by the year 2050. For a country, we talked about the topic and the different climatic zone and the location of the Gambia, placing us at the Sudano-Sahelian zone, which puts us at the receiving end of both droughts and floods. And we also talked about greenhouse gases and how nature is kind of academic to many people, but it shouldn't be. According to the chairperson of IPBS, that's the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, people seem to view biodiversity as an academic issue, but everyone can relate. And when we look at the natural response of biodiversity to climate change, there are usually three agreed steps. Either the biodiversity adapts to the change caused by climate change, moves to a different place, or dies or become extinct. And if you are looking at biodiversity at the level of marine, you would know that the second level adaptation is not possible, making marine environments more fragile than the terrestrial biodiversity. And talking about this, we tend to summarize the key drivers of biodiversity loss. Looking at it from a global level, land use change. Land use change is important, but as the topic of today, climate change is our focus. So when these drivers of biodiversity loss are not put in check, what happens? This puts the planet and the people in jeopardy. So all the 5 drivers that were identified at global level, if left unchecked, will cause people to disassociate with nature. And what does that mean? The loss of value and importance of nature to human in general. And that is dangerous to national development processes. In order for us to plan well for sustainable development, we need to be able to know the value of the resources that we are exploiting, but what we need to put back to ensure sustainability for future generations while we adapt as well to the changes imposed by climate change. So, as climate is a primary driver of biodiversity loss, we understand that. Yet the complicated thing is climate still relies on biodiversity as part of the solution. So in order to curb the greenhouse gases that, for example, leads to increased global temperature, changes in the ecosystem level, for example, we need to keep the biodiversity intact so that it can perform its functions, for example, of carbon sequestration, carbon storage, to continue to keep the climate impacts at a minimum. So that is my introduction. I don't want to go too in depth because I know Kama has some questions for me. So your questions are welcome.
Thank you very much, Dr. Cisse. Like you mentioned, biodiversity is very broad. If you want to look at the marine aspect, which is also even broad, talk less of talking about the terrestrial environment. Notwithstanding, this is the question I have for you. How does the loss of biodiversity affect sustainable development? Because whatever we are doing, at least there needs to be that sustainable development aspect of it. So if we have a continuous loss in biodiversity, and how do we cope that in order to have a sustainable development for all? And at the end, we are talking of Agenda 2030 and things like that. So we need to be very mindful of those ones if we really want to have a biodiversity that is sustainable for us. Thank you.
Thank you, Koma. Biodiversity loss, I think, is at the key of sustainable development. And if we lose the biodiversity that is supporting the basic economic sector of our country, it will not only lead to lower livelihood quality for the vulnerable communities depending on this biodiversity, but our commitments at global level as a nation. We, Gambia, for instance, have ratified nearly every convention there is to ratify for protection of biodiversity. We have ratified sub-regional, national, and international accords for climate change and adaptation. So if we lose our biodiversity, we take, for example, the Sustainable Development Goal. How do we uphold Sustainable Development Goal number one, for example, which is poverty alleviation? If the communities that are supposed to profit from these biodiversity and ecosystems cannot extract anything economically, our dream of poverty alleviation will go down the drain. It is the same thing in terms of food security, which is the sustainable development goal number two. And it goes all the way to number seven, which is even environmental sustainability. Because if the biodiversity is gone, the ecosystem services and functions will not work, and we will lose our capacity to achieve our mandates at national and international level.
Thank you. Talking of ecosystem services, can you give us a systematic review of the impact of climate change on biodiversity and associated vital ecosystem services, using Gambia as an example?
Thank you, Koma. That is a topic I am very happy to talk a bit about. As you know, Gambia is uniquely blessed, and this is not just saying, but scientifically proven. It is the only country in the world where you find the 3 points of a salinity gradient within a stretch of less than 400 kilometers. You can find marine water, you can find estuarine water, and you can find fresh water within that period. You cannot find it anywhere else in the world. So we have a lot to gain, but we also have a lot to lose, which puts us in a unique place, the Gambia. If you look, for example, when you talk about climate change and biodiversity loss, the thing that comes up is floods, droughts. But the Gambia's highest peak is less than 100 meters. What does that mean in the face of sea level rise? And what does it mean for the survival of our biodiversity? So the Gambia, like any other third world country, also has the usual problems to deal with: rapid population growth, pollution, and all that. Notwithstanding, the Gambia is home to many uh, globally valued biodiversity species. If you look, for example, in Africa, there are 9 species of mangroves. All 8 of them are found in Gambia. Given the tiny size of the Gambia, biodiversity is a whole deal for us. Looking at fisheries, for example, again, you look at the estuarine species that were confirmed in the Gambia, 49 species. You can find 46 of those in around Greater Banjul area. This is the unique situation of the Gambia, which means we have a lot to gain when biodiversity and ecosystem services dwindle. For provisioning services, you have food, water, and all that. Regulating services, you have water purification, oxygen. This is useful and important for a country as fragile and in a unique geographic position. Thus, it is important for people. What I always advocate for is to put together research and academia, government, private sector, civil society. Everyone needs to have a voice and a role in order to tackle the issue of biodiversity loss as it relates to climate change. The policies cannot go without the researchers, yet the business people try to go without the communities, and it doesn't work. So the most important thing for us is to make sure that we diversify the national development teams and bring everybody on board. This is how we will ensure that the proper scientific information is used to ensure that the development plans are tailored according to the carrying capacity of these ecosystems, because ecosystem service is the livelihood of the local and vulnerable communities of the Gambia.
Thank you very much. And that, like you mentioned, cannot be done collectively without that integrated approach. So whatever we are doing, everybody has to be involved. Um, when one aspect of the biodiversity is lost, of course, everybody feels the pain. So, in order to have a sustainable development and integrated approach to sustainable development per se is very, very important. And finally, I think there is a question from Mr. Jajusi for you, Adam. Jajusi, I don't know whether your mic is still struggling or you are okay now.
Hello. Okay. My mic is okay now, I think.
Okay, yeah, we can hear you. Thank you.
Yeah. Anyway, I didn't draft any question for Binta. It seems I've missed something, maybe. But what I will add here? What do you think the pollution in the Gambia is contributing to the biodiversity lost in the Gambia? How is pollution contributing to that from a layman perspective?
Thank you very much, Mr. Jajisi. This is actually a question we always welcome. When we say climate change, sometimes people think we are only interested in the natural degradation, but there is an interaction between the impacts of climate change and the activities of humans. So, if, for instance, your biodiversity is subjected to drought, it is adapting already to the problem of drought, and somebody dumps a toxic waste or something like that, then it is definitely not going to be able to go through the first phase of adaptation, adapting to the change. It is going to move to the next stage, which may not be possible if it is in a marine area. So, in terms of pollution, what I would say is to always find a meeting point. It is hard to study natural processes' impact on the biodiversity without the human impact. So you try to find a correlation between the natural processes and how the human activities like pollution can become a additional stressor.
Thank you very much. And you can see the interlinkage between
Absolutely.
this and the first presentation by Dr. Baji. So this is the reason why I stated that for his, though all of your presentations are very important, but he has the umbrella. So if the environment is not conducive, we will not talk about biodiversity, we will not talk about urbanization, we will not talk about all those things. So we need to put everything together. Like I always mention, that integrated approach to ecosystem management is very, very important. Thank you once again. And